They say the mountains have a way of keeping secrets. I used to think that meant the quiet refuge they offered, the privacy that came with the towering pines and endless miles of solitude. But now I wonder if they knew all along, if they could see right through me, watching as I let myself slip into something I couldn't undo. It wasn't supposed to happen. When Harold and I came up to the lodge for the season, I thought it would be like all the other summers, another retreat from the world, a chance to reconnect, to let the familiar rhythm of the mountains settle over us. But this year, Harold insisted on inviting his son. I told myself it was just a visit, a brief intrusion into our private world. But Gideon was different. He carried with him a quiet intensity, a presence that filled the lodge in a way I hadn't expected. He'd spent years traveling, chasing his own path, away from his father's watchful eye. And that independence lingered in every glance, every careful pause between his words. I wasn't prepared for him, for the pull I felt, for the quiet understanding that blossomed between us, a connection that felt as natural as it was forbidden. And then there was Harold. I could feel his eyes on us, even when he didn't say anything. The way he watched our conversations from the corner of the room, his questions laced with suspicion he tried to hide. He didn't know, not yet. But there was an intensity in his silence, a calculation that felt like the edge of a storm. I'd known Harold for decades. I knew that his patience only went so far. This isn't a story of love or even betrayal, though I suppose it might seem that way to anyone else. It's a story of choices, choices I can't take back, no matter how often I've tried to rewrite them in my mind. And now, as I sit here with the echoes of that summer still haunting the quiet of the mountains, I wonder if the price of freedom was worth what I lost, if I even understood what I was looking for at all. Maybe the mountains knew. Maybe they saw it all unfolding, waiting for me to realize that some secrets can never be buried. The lodge had always been Harold's pride, a sturdy timber and stone structure nestled at the edge of a lake, surrounded by towering pine trees and silent trails that wound up into the mountains. It was built generations ago, passed down through Harold's family, like a legacy, a place to retreat and reconnect with the land. Each year, Harold would make it a point to spend a month up here, embracing the solitude, the quiet, and I had come to accept it as part of our life together. A rhythm that set our years by the seasons. But this summer, the lodge felt different. It wasn't just the heavy, storm-riddled clouds that clung to the mountain peaks, or the endless quiet that settled around us as though we were the only two people left in the world. No, it was something else entirely. Something that began the moment Harold announced that Gideon would be joining us for the season. "He's coming for a few weeks, Evelyn," Harold had said casually over breakfast, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. I'd known of Gideon, of course. Harold's only child from his first marriage, a son who had spent years estranged from his father, off somewhere in the world that seemed too distant to touch our life together. I'd met him briefly at family gatherings, exchanged polite words and a smile, but I had never known him in any real way. Never expected him to enter our quiet world here in the mountains. I was a little taken aback when I heard the news. Harold didn't speak much of Gideon, and when he did, it was often with a hint of disappointment in his tone. He had hoped for a son who would take after him, who would appreciate the lodge, the land, who would see the world as a place to conquer rather than a place to wander. But Gideon had always been restless, more inclined to travel and explore than to stay grounded. But Harold, it seemed, wanted to bridge the distance between them. And in the weeks leading up to Gideon's arrival, he spoke of it as though it were an inevitability. That Gideon would see the lodge for what it was, that he would come to appreciate it as part of his legacy, his inheritance. I listened, nodding in agreement, though part of me wondered if Harold was clinging to an illusion, a vision of fatherhood that had little to do with the reality of his son. Gideon arrived on a clear afternoon, the sun dipping low over the mountains, casting long shadows across the lawn that stretched out before the lodge. I watched him pull up in an old, battered truck, his figure framed by the open door as he stepped out, surveying the lodge with a quiet intensity that caught me off guard. He was tall, with a lean, wiry build, his hair tousled and his clothes worn, as though he'd come straight from some adventure. There was a ruggedness about him, a calm self-assurance that felt out of place against the polished interior of the lodge. He carried a backpack slung over one shoulder and a camera around his neck, and he moved with a sense of ease, as though he had already made himself at home in this world of mountains and trees. Harold greeted him with a handshake and a nod, their exchange formal, almost tense, as though they were both trying to find their footing in unfamiliar territory. There was an awkwardness between them that seemed to hang in the air, a quiet reminder of the years they had spent apart, of the unresolved tension that lingered beneath the surface of their relationship. I stepped forward to greet him, offering a polite smile as he turned to me, his gaze steady, thoughtful. "Evelyn," he said, his voice warm but reserved. "It's been a while." I nodded, feeling a strange flutter in my chest as I met his gaze. "It has. It's good to see you, Gideon." There was a silence that followed, one that felt both comfortable and strange, as though we were both aware of the unspoken history that had brought us here, to this lodge, to this moment. And as we settled into our roles, Harold as the proud host, Gideon as the reluctant guest, and me as the quiet observer, I couldn't help but feel a shift in the air, a sense of anticipation that lingered in the silence between us. Over the next few days, we settled into a quiet routine. Harold would rise early each morning, taking his coffee out onto the porch to survey the land, his gaze fixed on the mountains as though he were drawing strength from their presence. Gideon, meanwhile, spent his days wandering through the woods, his camera always in hand, capturing moments that only he seemed to notice. A cluster of wildflowers blooming along the trail, the way the light filtered through the trees, the curve of the lake's edge as it disappeared into the forest. In the evenings, we would gather for dinner, the three of us sitting around the heavy oak table in the dining room, the fire crackling in the hearth as we shared stories of the day. Harold would ask Gideon about his travels, his work, each question tinged with a subtle hint of expectation, a quiet hope that perhaps this time his son would choose to stay, to settle into the life Harold had envisioned for him. But Gideon's answers were always the same, short, polite, his tone carrying a quiet defiance that spoke of a life lived on his own terms. He would nod, smile, and then turn the conversation back to the land, the mountains, the wild beauty that surrounded us, as though he were more interested in the world beyond the lodge than the legacy Harold had tried to build within it. And then there was me, caught in the middle, watching their interactions with a growing sense of fascination, of curiosity. Gideon was unlike anyone I had known, a man with a calm, quiet energy, a sense of independence that felt both foreign and familiar, a reminder of a life I had left behind long ago. And as I watched him, I felt something stir within me, a longing I couldn't quite name, a desire for something I hadn't realized I was missing. One afternoon, as Harold was out tending to some maintenance work on the trails, I found Gideon in the library, his camera resting on the table beside him, a book open in his hands. He looked up as I entered, offering a small, quiet smile, and for a moment I felt a flutter of nervousness, a sense of vulnerability I hadn't felt in years. "Finding everything you need?" I asked, my voice softer than I had intended, the words laced with a warmth I hadn't meant to reveal. He nodded, setting the book aside. "I am, actually. It's peaceful here, different from what I'm used to." There was a pause, a silence that felt both comfortable and charged, as though we were both aware of something unspoken, something that lingered just beneath the surface. "You must travel a lot," I said, feeling a strange need to fill the silence, to understand the man who had stepped into our lives with such quiet confidence. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I do. It's liberating, I suppose. The freedom to move, to explore. I never felt like I belonged anywhere, so I just kept going." His words struck a chord in me, a reminder of the restless energy I had once felt, a longing for freedom that had faded over the years, replaced by the comfort and security of a life built with Harold. And yet, as I looked at Gideon, I felt a spark of that old desire, a yearning for something more, something wild and untamed. "Do you ever get tired of it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, the question carrying more weight than I had intended. He looked at me, his gaze steady, and for a moment I felt as though he could see right through me, as though he understood the quiet longing that lingered in my heart. "Sometimes," he admitted, his voice soft, thoughtful. "But it's hard to stop, you know? Once you start moving, it's hard to imagine staying still." There was a vulnerability in his words, a hint of something deeper. And as we sat there in the quiet of the library, I felt a connection forming between us, a bond that felt both thrilling and dangerous. A reminder that even in the stillness of the mountains, secrets could find their way into the light. From that day on, our interactions took on a new intensity. There was a quiet understanding between us, a sense of closeness that grew with each passing day, each conversation. We were careful, cautious, our words laced with a subtle tension that hinted at something more, something neither of us dared to name. But there was no denying the pull between us, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long, the way his presence seemed to fill the empty spaces around me. And as I lay awake at night, listening to the quiet sounds of the lodge, I felt a mixture of excitement and guilt, a reminder that I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't fully understand. A choice that would change everything. It started with a touch, brief and almost accidental, the kind that could have been easily explained away. We were standing on the porch one evening, watching as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the trees. Gideon's hand brushed against mine, lingering just a second too long, and in that moment I felt a spark that sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment, a trick of the light, something I could ignore. But as the days passed, that touch lingered in my mind, a reminder of the connection that had quietly blossomed between us. There was an intimacy in our silences, a shared understanding that filled the spaces between our words, and as much as I tried to ignore it, I couldn't deny the way he made me feel. Harold, of course, remained oblivious. His days were spent overseeing repairs around the lodge, checking the paths and trails that wound through the mountains, lost in his own world. He would come in for dinner, his expression relaxed, his tone warm, and I would sit across from him, my heart pounding as I tried to pretend that everything was the same, that I hadn't crossed a line I couldn't uncross. But with each passing day, that line blurred, becoming less of a boundary and more of an invitation. One evening, while Harold was out inspecting the property, Gideon found me in the small reading room. A space tucked away in the corner of the lodge, lined with shelves of old books and a single window that looked out over the forest. I was flipping through an old photo album, a collection of memories from years past, when he entered, his presence filling the room with a quiet energy that made my heart race. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice soft, almost hesitant. I nodded, my gaze lingering on the photo album, though I could feel his eyes on me, a warmth that seemed to wrap around me, pulling me into his orbit. He sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his shoulder against mine, the faint scent of pine and earth clinging to his clothes. We sat in silence for a moment, flipping through the pages of the album. each photo a snapshot of a time I could barely remember, a life that felt distant and foreign. And then, without warning, he reached out, his hand covering mine, his touch gentle, reassuring. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, the space between us seemed to disappear. The air thick with unspoken words, a connection that felt both thrilling and terrifying. "Evelyn," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper, and in that single word I felt a surge of emotion, a longing I hadn't realized I was capable of feeling. I don't know who leaned in first, whether it was him or me, whether it mattered at all. But in that moment, our lips met, a soft, tentative kiss that sent a rush of warmth through me, a reminder of the passion I had buried beneath years of loyalty and routine. When we pulled away, there was a silence, a brief moment of hesitation, as though we were both waiting for reality to intrude, for the weight of what we had done to settle over us. But that moment never came. Instead, we sat there, the quiet of the lodge surrounding us, a shared understanding passing between us, a promise of something deeper, something we could no longer ignore. From that night on, our relationship changed. We became careful, cautious, finding moments of solitude in the quiet corners of the lodge, hidden away from Harold's watchful eyes. There was a thrill in the secrecy, in the knowledge that we were treading on dangerous ground, that each encounter, each shared glance, was a risk we were both willing to take. We developed a rhythm, a dance of stolen glances and subtle touches, of whispered words exchanged in the stillness of the night. Gideon would find me in the mornings, his gaze lingering just a moment too long, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips, and I would feel a warmth spread through me, a reminder of the connection we shared, the secret that bound us together. But with each encounter, the weight of our secret grew heavier. I would lie awake at night, listening to the sound of Harold's breathing beside me, feeling the ache of guilt settle over me, a reminder of the life I was risking, the loyalty I was betraying. I tried to tell myself it was temporary, a fleeting escape from a life that had grown too quiet, too predictable. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. This wasn't just a momentary lapse, a passing attraction. It was something deeper, something I couldn't simply walk away from. As the days passed, our relationship deepened, each stolen moment drawing us closer, binding us together in a way that felt as inevitable as it was dangerous. We shared more than just touches and glances. We shared stories, secrets, pieces of ourselves that we had kept hidden from the world. One afternoon, as we sat by the lake, hidden from view by the trees, he told me about his childhood. The years he had spent moving from place to place, chasing a life that felt as fleeting as the seasons. He spoke of his mother, a woman I had never met, but who lingered in his memory like a shadow, a reminder of the family he had left behind. "I never felt like I belonged anywhere," he admitted, his gaze distant, his voice filled with a quiet sadness. "I thought maybe coming here would change that." I looked at him, feeling a pang of empathy, a connection that went beyond the physical, a shared understanding of the loneliness that had shaped us both. "I know what you mean," I whispered, my voice barely audible, and in that moment I felt a surge of affection, a warmth that filled the empty spaces in my heart, a reminder that I was no longer alone. But with that closeness came a sense of vulnerability, a fear that our secret was no longer as hidden as I had thought. Harold had started to notice my absences, the moments when I would disappear into the woods or linger in the quiet rooms of the lodge, my mind elsewhere. He would ask questions, subtle and probing, his gaze lingering on me with a hint of suspicion, as though he were piecing together a puzzle I hadn't meant for him to see. And as I looked at him, feeling the weight of his gaze, I realized that our secret was a fragile thing, a delicate balance that could shatter with the slightest misstep. One evening, as I lay awake beside Harold, the weight of our secret pressing down on me, I felt a surge of fear, a realization that I was caught between two lives, two worlds, each pulling me in opposite directions. I couldn't keep this up forever. The lies, the secrecy, the guilt that lingered like a shadow in every corner of the lodge. I knew what I was risking, knew the price I would pay if Harold discovered the truth. But as I thought of Gideon, of the connection we shared, I felt a quiet resolve settle over me. A determination to hold on to this, to keep this fragile bond alive, no matter the cost. And so, as the days passed, I made a choice. A choice to continue, to let myself be drawn into Gideon's world, to ignore the warnings, the doubts, the fear that whispered in the back of my mind. It was a choice I couldn't take back, a choice that would lead us both down a path I could never have predicted, a path that would change everything. The days following that decision became a careful dance of secrecy and caution. I felt a thrill. Yes, each time I found Gideon waiting in the quiet shadows of the lodge, or down by the lake's edge, his presence a constant reminder of the connection we shared. But with that thrill came a gnawing anxiety, a sense that our time was running out, that we were moving toward something inevitable, something we could no longer control. Harold, meanwhile, seemed to grow more observant. His questions were sharper, his gaze more lingering, and though he rarely confronted anything directly, I could feel his suspicion simmering beneath the surface. He would watch me as I moved through the lodge, his expression thoughtful, his silence a damning reminder of the boundaries I had crossed. And then there were the caretakers and the few visitors who occasionally dropped by, old friends or neighbors who had known Harold for years. Martha, the lodge's caretaker, was a woman in her 60s, practical and shrewd, with a way of seeing through people that made me feel both vulnerable and exposed. She would catch my gaze sometimes, her expression unreadable, a flicker of something knowing in her eyes that left me unsettled. One afternoon, as I was tidying the library, Martha entered, her footsteps soft on the carpet. She paused, looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Everett?" she asked, her voice calm, but with an undertone of something else, something that made my heart race. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, of course, Martha. Why wouldn't it be?" She nodded, though her gaze remained fixed on me, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes things have a way of surfacing in these mountains," she murmured, her words lingering in the air like a warning, a reminder that even the quietest secrets could find their way into the light. That evening, Harold seemed especially watchful. We sat by the fireplace, the room filled with the soft crackle of the flames, the warm glow casting shadows across his face. He looked at me over the rim of his glass, his gaze steady, almost searching, as though he were waiting for me to reveal something, to confess. "You've been different lately, Evelyn," he said, his tone calm but edged with a quiet intensity. "I can't help but wonder if something's on your mind." I felt my heart race, a flush of panic creeping up my neck as I forced myself to meet his gaze. "I've just been distracted, Harold. It's the lodge, the season, you know how I get." He nodded, though his expression remained skeptical, his eyes lingering on me as though he were trying to peel back the layers, to see what lay hidden beneath the surface. I could feel his suspicion pressing down on me, a weight that grew heavier with each passing day, each stolen moment with Gideon. But Harold said nothing more, choosing instead to sit in silence, his presence a quiet reminder of the consequences that awaited us both. The following week, while Harold was out inspecting the property, I stumbled upon something that changed everything. I was in the small office on the second floor, searching for a file Harold had asked me to retrieve, when I came across a folder tucked into the back of a drawer. It was worn, the edges frayed, as though it had been handled many times, and when I opened it, I felt a chill settle over me. Inside were a series of documents, financial records, legal papers, and letters from creditors, each one bearing Gideon's name. The documents painted a picture of a life filled with struggles and debts, a history I hadn't known, a past he had kept hidden from me. There were payments overdue, notices of default, even a letter from a bank threatening legal action. My heart sank as I absorbed the implications, the questions that began to surface, each one sharper, more troubling than the last. Had Gideon come to the lodge because of these debts? Was he using me, our connection, as a way to escape his troubles, to find some reprieve from the life he had left behind? I closed the folder, my mind racing, the weight of my discoveries pressing down on me, suffocating me. I had wanted to believe in him, to trust that what we shared was real. But now, with the evidence before me, I couldn't help but wonder if I had been blind, caught up in a fantasy, a desire that had clouded my judgment. That evening, as I found Gideon down by the lake, I felt a sense of betrayal, a quiet anger that simmered beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice trembling, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He looked at me, his expression softening, a flicker of regret in his eyes. "Tell you what, Evelyn?" I held up the folder, my gaze hard, my heart pounding with the weight of my suspicions. "About this, about the debts, the trouble you're in." He looked away, his shoulders slumping, and for a moment I thought he might leave, that he would slip back into the shadows where he had come from. But then he sighed, his voice filled with a quiet resignation. "I didn't want you to know. I thought I could leave that behind, that it didn't matter here." His words sent a pang of sadness through me, a reminder of the love I had thought we shared, the connection that had seemed so real, so tangible. I wanted to forgive him, to hold on to that love, but the doubts lingered, casting shadows over everything. A reminder that our relationship had been built on lies, on secrets that could no longer remain hidden. In the days that followed, Martha's presence became a quiet but constant reminder of the danger we were in. She would watch me with a knowing look, her gaze lingering a second too long, as though she could see through the facade I had so carefully constructed. There was something almost comforting in her presence, a sense that she understood, that she had seen secrets like mine before, hidden in the shadows of these mountains. One afternoon, as I sat alone in the kitchen, she joined me, her expression thoughtful, her voice calm as she spoke. "You know, secrets have a way of coming to light," she murmured, her gaze fixed on me, a flicker of sympathy in her eyes. "It's the mountains, I think. They don't keep things hidden for long." Her words sent a chill through me, a reminder that our time was running out, that the delicate balance we had maintained was beginning to unravel. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself that she was just an old woman with a habit of prying. But the fear lingered, a gnawing sense of dread that followed me through each day, each encounter with Harold and Gideon. It was inevitable, I suppose, that Harold would find out, that our secret would come to light. He confronted me one evening, his face drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and betrayal that left me breathless, my heart pounding as I braced myself for the words I had dreaded, the truth I could no longer deny. "How long?" he asked, his voice low, barely more than a whisper. "How long have you been seeing him?" I opened my mouth to deny it, to lie, but the words caught in my throat, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me, suffocating me. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze, and in that moment, I knew that the truth was written across my face, that there was no hiding from the consequences of the choices I had made. "I trusted you, Evelyn," he murmured, his voice thick with betrayal, and I felt my heart shatter, the fragments scattering into 1,000 pieces, each one a reminder of the love I had betrayed. I wanted to apologize, to explain, to beg for his forgiveness, but I knew that it was too late, that the damage had been done. And as Harold turned away, his silence a final condemnation, I realized that I had lost everything, that the life I had built was gone, torn apart by the choices I had made and the lies I had told. The morning after Harold confronted me, the lodge was silent, each corner heavy with the weight of what had been revealed. Harold moved through the rooms like a ghost, his gaze distant, his expression unreadable, and I felt the chill of his presence, the bitterness that had settled between us. I wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words felt hollow, meaningless in the face of the damage I had done. Gideon, too, was different. He no longer moved through the lodge with the same careless ease. Instead, he stayed to himself, his footsteps soft, his face shadowed with an expression that I couldn't read. There was a tension in him, a quiet anger that simmered just beneath the surface, and I could feel it growing, like a storm gathering on the horizon. That evening, Harold called us both into the main room of the lodge. The sky outside was dark, a storm brewing over the mountains, casting the room in a dim, eerie light. Harold stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze steady, unyielding as he looked at us. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a sense of foreboding settling over me as I realized that this was it, the moment that would decide everything. "I think it's time we address the truth," Harold said, his voice cold, detached. "No more lies, no more secrets. I want to know everything." I opened my mouth to speak, to offer some kind of explanation, but the words wouldn't come. I looked at Gideon, hoping for some reassurance, but his expression was hard, his gaze distant, as though he, too, were caught in the weight of our choices. Harold's gaze shifted to Gideon, a flicker of anger darkening his eyes. "How long, Gideon? How long have you been planning this?" Gideon straightened, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Planning what, exactly? I didn't plan to fall for Evelyn. But maybe I did plan to see the look on your face when you realized you'd lost her." The words hit like a slap, and I felt my heart ache, a mixture of anger and regret sting inside me. Gideon's words were defiant, calculated, each one a reminder of the resentment he had carried, the bitterness that had brought him back to this lodge, to this moment. Harold took a step forward, his fists clenched, his voice filled with barely restrained fury. "You think this is a game? You think you can just take what you want and walk away?" Gideon held his ground, his gaze unwavering. "Isn't that what you've always done, Harold? Taken whatever you wanted, left everyone else to pick up the pieces?" Their voices grew louder, each word a blow, each accusation a wound that had festered for years. And as I stood there, caught between them, I realized that I was nothing more than a pawn in their battle, a casualty of a war that had been waged long before I entered their lives. I stepped forward, my voice trembling as I tried to intervene. "Please, stop this. This isn't about me. This is about both of you, about the resentment you've both carried for years. Can't you see what this is doing to us?" But my words fell on deaf ears. They were too caught up in their anger, too blinded by the wounds of the past to see anything beyond their own pain. Harold lunged at Gideon, his fists clenched, his face twisted in rage. They collided, each of them grappling for control, their bodies crashing into furniture, their grunts and shouts filling the room. I tried to intervene, to pull them apart, but they were locked in their struggle, each of them fueled by a lifetime of resentment, of anger that had been buried too long. I could see the hatred in their eyes, the need to destroy each other, to tear down the walls that had held them captive for so many years. And then, with a sickening thud, Harold stumbled backward, his hand clutching his chest, his face pale, stricken. He gasped, his body crumpling to the floor, and in that moment, I knew that something irreversible had happened, that we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I knelt beside Harold, my hands trembling as I tried to revive him, but his eyes were unfocused, his breath shallow, fading. I looked up at Gideon, his face stricken, as though he couldn't believe what had just happened. "Call an ambulance," I whispered, my voice thick with panic. But he didn't move, his gaze fixed on Harold's still form, as though he were rooted to the spot. I didn't wait for him to respond. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed the number, my voice frantic as I gave them our address, begging them to come quickly, to save the man I had once loved, the man I had betrayed. But it was too late. Harold's breathing slowed, his gaze unfocused, and I knew, even before the paramedics arrived, that he was gone, that our betrayal had cost him everything. As I sat there, cradling his lifeless body, a wave of grief washed over me, a grief so deep, so all-consuming, that it left me hollow, broken. I looked up at Gideon, his face pale, stricken, and in that moment, I knew that whatever we had shared was over, that we had destroyed each other in ways that could never be repaired. The police arrived, their questions a blur as they moved through the lodge, taking notes, asking questions, their voices muted, distant. Gideon stood silently by the door, his face unreadable, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls, as though he were already gone, as though he had already left this place, this life, behind. When they finally left, when the lodge was quiet again, Gideon turned to me, his expression a mixture of regret and resignation. "I never wanted this," he murmured, his voice barely audible, and I felt a pang of sadness, a reminder of the love we had shared, the love that had been twisted by lies and secrets, by the darkness that had always lingered just beneath the surface. "Neither did I whispered, my voice breaking, and for a moment we simply stood there, the silence between us filled with the weight of our choices, the knowledge that we had destroyed each other in ways that could never be undone. And then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door, leaving me alone in the lodge that had once been our sanctuary, our prison, the place where everything had begun and ended. As I watched him go, a quiet emptiness settled over me, a realization that I had lost everything, my love, my life, the dreams I had once held so close. I had gambled everything for a fleeting moment of passion, for a love that had been as fragile as the secrets we had kept, and now I was left with nothing but the silence, the shadows that lingered in the empty rooms, the memories of a life that had slipped through my fingers. In the weeks that followed Harold's death, the lodge became a place of ghosts. I wandered through its rooms, each one holding a fragment of the life I'd left behind. The silence was heavy, pressing down like the weight of the mountains themselves, reminding me of what I'd lost, of the decisions that had brought me to this desolate, empty place. After Gideon left, I thought I'd feel a sense of relief, as though his absence would somehow bring me peace, but instead there was only emptiness. I realized slowly that he had been just a catalyst, a spark that had ignited something that was already unraveling inside me. Our connection had been real, yes, but it had been fueled by something darker, a longing for freedom, for excitement, a desire to escape a life that had felt increasingly like a prison. And now, with Harold gone, with Gideon gone, I was left alone to face the consequences of my choices. I sat by the lake, listening to the wind rustling through the trees, watching as the water mirrored the sky, a calm surface hiding depths I could never fully understand. It reminded me of myself, of the secrets I had kept, the lies I had told, the pain I had caused in my search for something I couldn't even name. As the days passed, I began to see my life with a clarity I hadn't had before, as though the events of the summer had stripped away the illusions I had clung to, leaving me bare, exposed to my own weaknesses, my own desires. I realized that I had been searching for something to fill a void, a hollow place inside me that had grown over the years, fed by a quiet dissatisfaction, a loneliness I had never been willing to face. Harold had been my anchor, my safety, the life I had chosen for its stability, its comfort. He had given me a place in the world, a sense of purpose, of belonging, and yet I had betrayed him in the most fundamental way, sacrificing that security for a fleeting passion, a a connection that had felt like a lifeline but had ultimately left me more isolated than ever. There was no going back, no way to undo what I had done. The damage was irreparable, and I knew that, even if I could find a way to forgive myself, I would always carry the weight of what had happened, a burden that would shadow me for the rest of my life. I stayed at the lodge through the end of the season, spending my days in the quiet, the solitude, letting the stillness seep into my bones. The mountains seemed to hold a strange kind of wisdom, a reminder that life went on, that even in the wake of loss, there was a path forward, a way to rebuild, to start again. I began to find solace in the simplicity of each day, the small tasks that grounded me, the gathering of firewood, the tending of the garden, the quiet moments by the lake. I learned to sit with my own thoughts, to face the regret, the sorrow, the memories of what had been. And in time, those memories began to soften, to fade, becoming a part of the landscape, a story woven into the fabric of the lodge itself. People from town would occasionally come by, offering their condolences, their sympathy, but I accepted their words with a quiet nod, a smile, a reminder that I was still here, still standing, still alive. I had lost everything, yes, but in that loss I had found a strange kind of freedom, a release from the illusions I had once held so dear. In the end, I left the lodge, selling it to a young couple who saw it as a place of possibility, a blank slate upon which they could build their own lives, their own memories. I packed my things, the remnants of a life that felt distant, almost foreign. And I walked away from the place that had been my sanctuary and my prison, the place where I had found love and where I had lost it. I moved to a small town by the coast, a place far removed from the mountains, from the shadows of my past. I found a modest cottage overlooking the sea, a place where I could start fresh, where I could rebuild without the weight of the past pressing down on me. I began to paint again, to capture the beauty of the ocean, the ever-changing colors of the waves, the light that danced across the water. Each brushstroke was a way of releasing the grief, the regret, the sorrow that lingered in the corners of my heart, a way of moving forward, of letting go. And as I stand here now, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I feel a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of the life I have lived, the choices I have made, the love I have lost. I will carry those memories with me, yes, but they no longer define me. They are simply part of my story, a chapter I have closed, a lesson I have learned, at a cost I can finally accept. It was the kind of moment that should never happen. 1 second, I was stepping out of the bathtub, reaching for the towel I'd left on the counter. The next, my foot slipped on the edge of the damp tile and I fell forward, my towel slipping away as I hit the cold floor. Before I could even gather my senses, I heard the door creak open. "Evelyn, are you?" Aaron's voice cut off mid-sentence as he stood frozen in the doorway. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt electric, heavy with a mix of shock and something unspoken. His eyes met mine, wide with concern at first, but then they flicked downward, just for a second. I scrambled to grab the towel, my hands trembling as I pulled it around me. My face burned, humiliation coursing through me as I stammered. I'm fine, you shouldn't be in here." "I heard a noise," he said quickly, his voice tight, his gaze darting anywhere but at me now. "I thought something happened." "It's nothing," I insisted, though my voice betrayed me. My heart was pounding, and it wasn't just from the fall. Aaron lingered for a moment too long, his hand gripping the doorframe. "Are you sure? You look. Just go," I snapped, desperate to end the unbearable tension. He nodded, backing out of the room and closing the door behind him. The sound of his footsteps retreating down the hall was deafening, and I sat there on the bathroom floor, clutching the towel to my chest as if it could somehow shield me from what had just happened. It wasn't just embarrassment that left me shaken. It was the way he had looked at me. That brief flicker in his eyes before he'd turned away. It was an accident. I knew that. But in that fleeting moment, something had shifted, and no amount of rationalizing could undo it. When I finally emerged from the bathroom, I found him in the kitchen, pretending to be busy with a plate of leftovers. He didn't look up when I walked in, and I hesitated in the doorway, unsure of what to say. "I'm sorry," he said abruptly, his voice breaking the silence. "I didn't mean to." "I know," I interrupted, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "Let's just forget it happened, okay?" He nodded quickly, his shoulders tense as he stared down at his plate. "Yeah, of course. But we both knew it wasn't that simple. It was an accident," I told myself repeatedly. Just an awkward, uncomfortable moment that we'd both move past. But as the days went on, I couldn't ignore the subtle changes in the air between us. The lingering glances, the charged silences, the way my heart raced every time we crossed paths. What had started as an innocent mistake was quickly becoming something I couldn't control. Before Aaron moved back into the house, my days followed a simple, predictable rhythm. Mornings were spent tending the garden, afternoons lost to household chores or reading in the sunlit corner of the living room, and evenings stretched into quiet solitude while my husband, Frank, busied himself with his endless hobbies or stayed out late with his golf buddies. Frank and I had been married for 13 years, a second marriage for both of us. By the time we met, neither of us were looking for romance, just companionship. And that's what we'd become to each other. Companions who shared a house but not much else. Frank's idea of quality time was discussing his latest stock tips over coffee, and I had long since stopped hoping for anything deeper. Then Aaron came home. Frank's son had always been polite but distant with me. Our relationship had never been close, mostly because I saw him only during the occasional holiday or family event. He had spent most of his 20s in the city, chasing a career in architecture and a series of girlfriends who never seemed to last. When his latest breakup sent him reeling, Frank insisted he come home for a while to reset. "We've got the space," Frank had said casually over dinner. "And I'm sure you won't mind having someone around during the day while I'm out." I smiled tightly and nodded. What else could I say? Frank rarely consulted me on decisions like this. The day Aaron arrived, I was standing at the sink, rinsing out coffee mugs, when I heard his voice in the foyer. "Hey, Dad," he called out, his deep, easy tone filling the house. I wiped my hands on a towel and turned just as he appeared in the doorway. "Evelyn," he said with a nod, his lips curling into a polite smile. "Aaron," I replied, returning the gesture. He had changed since I last saw him. Gone was the lanky college kid with shaggy hair and baggy clothes. The man standing in front of me was broad-shouldered, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his posture confident. He had an air of casual charm about him, the kind that made people gravitate toward him without effort. "I appreciate you letting me crash here for a while," he said, his tone sincere. "Of course," I replied, though I wasn't sure what else to say. Frank appeared then, clapping Aaron on the back. "Let's get you settled," he said, guiding him toward the stairs. I watched them go, a strange tension settling in my chest that I couldn't quite place. It didn't take long for Aaron to settle into the rhythms of the house. He spent his mornings at the dining room table with his laptop, job hunting, or working on design projects. In the afternoons, he often helped me in the garden or fixed things around the house that Frank had been ignoring for years. "You've got quite the green thumb," he remarked one day as I showed him how to prune the rose bushes. "It's just a hobby," I said, though I couldn't help but smile at the compliment. "Well, it shows," he said, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he turned back to the roses. It was little moments like that, small, harmless exchanges, that began to shift the dynamic between us. Frank, of course, was oblivious. He spent most of his days on the golf course or in his study, tinkering with his antique watch collection. The few times he was home for dinner, he and Aaron would talk stocks and sports, while I quietly sipped my wine and pretended not to notice the way Aaron's eyes would flick to mine when he thought no one else was looking. It wasn't just me who noticed the change. Even our housekeeper, Mabel, commented on it one afternoon while she was dusting the shelves in the living room. "Aaron's a handsome young man," she said casually, her tone teasing. I laughed softly, shaking my head. "You should tell him that. I'm sure he'd appreciate the ego boost." Mabel smirked. "Oh, he doesn't need me to tell him. He already knows. Her words stuck with me, though I wasn't sure why. And then there was the incident with the tub. For days after, I tried to convince myself that it hadn't meant anything, that it was just an awkward moment we'd both moved past. But something had shifted between us, and no amount of denial could change that. It was in the way Aaron lingered in the kitchen while I cooked, his questions about my day more thoughtful than they needed to be. It was in the way he looked at me when Frank wasn't paying attention, his gaze steady and searching. And it was in the way I felt when he was near, an awareness I hadn't felt in years. A pull I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the guest room, Aaron appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. "Need a hand?" he asked. I shook my head, my heart skipping a beat at his sudden presence. "I've got it." He stepped inside anyway, picking up a towel from the pile and folding it with surprising precision. "Thanks," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he placed the towel on the bed and turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "About the other day." I froze, my hands stilling over the pile of laundry. "Let's not talk about it," I said quickly. "Why not?" he pressed, his voice soft but insistent. "Because it doesn't mean anything," I replied, though the words felt hollow. Aaron stepped closer, his eyes locked on mine. "Are you sure about that?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The air between us felt heavy, charged, and I knew that whatever line we'd been towing was about to be crossed. The first kiss was a mistake, or at least, that's what I told myself afterward. It happened late one evening after Frank had gone to bed. I was in the living room, curled up with a book I wasn't really reading, when Aaron walked in. He was barefoot, his shirt untucked, and he had that disheveled, end-of-the-day look that only made him seem more relaxed, more confident. "Still up?" he asked, his voice low, casual. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, setting the book aside. "What about you?" He shrugged, leaning against the doorway. "Just thinking." "About?" He hesitated for a moment, then stepped further into the room. "About what I'm doing here. What I'm doing with my life." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "It's kind of pathetic, isn't it? Coming back here at my age." "It's not pathetic," I said quickly. "Everyone needs a reset sometimes." He gave me a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You really believe that?" "Yes," I said firmly. "And you shouldn't be so hard on yourself. You're allowed to figure things out." Aaron looked at me then, really looked at me, and the air in the room shifted. "You're easy to talk to," he said softly. I smiled, trying to ignore the way my pulse quickened. "That's what stepmothers are for, right?" "That's not what I meant," he said, taking another step closer. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he was there, standing in front of me, his gaze locked on mine. "Evelyn," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have stopped him. I should have said something, anything, to break the spell, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed frozen as he leaned down, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was soft, hesitant, but full of everything we hadn't been saying. When he pulled back, I stared at him, my heart racing. "Aaron, we can't." "I know," he said quickly, his voice raw. "I know we shouldn't, but I can't stop thinking about you." His words hit me like a tidal wave, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Then I stood, stepping back, putting distance between us. "This can't happen," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. Aaron nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'm sorry. I needed you to know how I feel." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I turned and left the room, my thoughts a whirlwind of guilt and confusion. But it didn't end there. The tension between us only grew in the days that followed. We avoided being alone together, but every glance, every accidental touch felt like a spark waiting to ignite. One afternoon, I found him in the kitchen, washing dishes. He glanced at me as I walked in, his expression guarded. "About the other night," he said, breaking the silence. "Let's not talk about it," I said quickly. "Why not?" he asked, his tone quiet but insistent. "Because it was a mistake," I said, though even as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. Aaron set down the dish he was holding and turned to face me. "It didn't feel like a mistake to me." I froze, my heart pounding. "Aaron." "I mean it, Evelyn," he said, his voice steady. "I've never felt like this about anyone before, and I know it's wrong, but I can't ignore it." I looked away, my chest tightening. "This isn't fair, to Frank, to either of us." "Do you love him?" Aaron asked suddenly, his question cutting through the air like a knife. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Aaron nodded, a faint, bitter smile on his lips. That's what I thought. The second kiss wasn't a mistake. It happened a week later, late at night, when Frank was out at one of his poker games. I was in the garden, trimming the rose bushes by the light of the patio lamp, when Aaron appeared. You're always out here, he said, his voice breaking the silence. It's peaceful, I replied, not turning around. He stepped closer, his presence sending a jolt through me. You're avoiding me. I'm not, I said, though we both knew it wasn't true. You are, he insisted, his tone soft but firm. And I get it, I do. But I need to know. Do you feel it too? Or am I imagining this? I turned to face him, my breath catching at the look in his eyes, so open, so vulnerable. Aaron, this is complicated, I said quietly. That's not an answer, he replied, stepping closer. I hesitated, my heart pounding, before finally whispering, yes, I feel it too. He didn't wait for me to say anything else. He closed the distance between us, his hands cupping my face as he kissed me. This time, there was no hesitation, no restraint, and this time, I didn't stop him. What started as a single moment spiraled into something neither of us could control. We were careful at first, stealing moments when Frank wasn't around, keeping our relationship hidden behind closed doors. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to hide. One afternoon, while Frank was at the driving range, Aaron and I sat in the library, our heads close together as we pretended to discuss a book. His hand brushed mine, and I pulled away quickly, my eyes darting to the doorway. This is too risky, I whispered. Aaron leaned closer, his voice low. You're worth the risk. His words sent a shiver through me, and for a moment I forgot about everything else. The danger, the guilt, the consequences. But danger was always lurking. It was during one of these moments that Mabel, our housekeeper, walked in unexpectedly. I was in the kitchen with Aaron, his hand resting lightly on my waist as I leaned against the counter. Mabel froze in the doorway, her eyes flicking between us. Am I interrupting something? I stepped away from Aaron quickly, my face burning. No, of course not, I said, my voice higher than usual. Mabel didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes told me she wasn't convinced. As she left the room, Aaron turned to me, his expression serious. She knows, he said quietly. She doesn't know anything, I replied, though my voice wavered. We need to be more careful, he said, his jaw tightening. I nodded, but the knot of fear in my chest refused to ease. Secrets like ours are never safe for long. The house that had once felt so quiet, so predictable, now felt like a trap. Every creak of the floorboards, every unexpected knock on the door, was a reminder of how fragile the illusion of normalcy really was. It wasn't just Mabel's knowing glances or Aaron's inability to hide his growing frustration. The real threat came in the form of Frank's sister, Claire, and Aaron's best friend, Jeremy, two people who had a knack for prying where they didn't belong. Claire was the first to sense that something was off. She arrived unannounced one Sunday morning, her arms laden with groceries and her sharp eyes scanning the house as though she were an investigator looking for clues. Thought I'd come by and check on my brother's little kingdom, she said, her tone dripping with passive aggressiveness. Claire, I said, forcing a smile as I took a bag from her arms. This is a surprise. Good thing too, she replied, stepping past me into the kitchen. Surprises keep everyone honest. Frank chuckled, completely missing the edge in her tone as he followed her inside. But I didn't. Over the next hour, Claire made herself at home, asking questions that seemed innocent but were anything but. So, how's Aaron adjusting? She asked, her gaze flicking to me as she sipped her coffee. Fine, I replied quickly. He's been a big help around the house. I'll bet, she said, her smile sharp. It's nice to see him spending time here. He's always had a way of charming his way into people's lives. The implication in her words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe you can give him a nudge about getting back out there, Claire continued, turning to Frank. It's not healthy for him to stay cooped up here too long. Don't you think, Evelyn? Her eyes bore into mine, and I realized she wasn't just fishing. She was hunting. Then there was Jeremy. He showed up later that same week, his usual laid-back demeanor masking a sharpness that put me on edge. He and Aaron spent most of the afternoon in the backyard, drinking beers and catching up. But when I stepped outside to bring them some snacks, the conversation stopped abruptly. "Hey, Evelyn," Jeremy said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We were just talking about you." "Nothing bad, I hope," I replied, forcing a laugh. "Not at all," he said, though his gaze lingered on Aaron for a moment too long. "Just wondering how you're keeping this guy in line." Aaron shifted uncomfortably, and I quickly changed the subject, but the tension in the air was palpable. Later, when I passed the living room, I overheard snippets of their conversation. "She's great, isn't she?" Jeremy was saying. "Jeremy, don't," Aaron replied, his tone sharp. "I'm just saying," Jeremy continued. "You're acting different, man, and I think I know why." The close calls didn't end there. One afternoon, while Frank was out, Aaron and I were in the library. He was sitting beside me on the couch, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his arm against mine. "You're tense," he said quietly, his voice full of concern. "I'm fine," I replied, though my hands were trembling as I tried to focus on the book in my lap. "No, you're not," he insisted, his hand brushing mine. I looked up at him, my chest tightening. "Aaron, we can't keep doing this." His expression hardened. "Don't say that. Not after everything." Before I could respond, the sound of a door closing echoed through the house. "Evelyn?" Claire's voice called out, followed by the unmistakable click of her heels on the hardwood floor. Aaron and I jumped apart, panic flashing in his eyes as I stood quickly, smoothing my dress. "In here," I called out, my voice shaky. Claire appeared in the doorway a moment later, her gaze flicking between us. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, though the smug look on her face told me she wasn't sorry at all. "Just dropping off some papers for Frank." "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. She lingered for a moment too long before finally turning and leaving. As soon as she was gone, I sank onto the couch, my heart racing. "She's watching us," Aaron said quietly. "I know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The pressure was unbearable. Between Claire's suspicion, Jeremy's probing, and Mabel's knowing looks, I felt like the walls were closing in. Then, one evening, Frank blindsided me. We were sitting at the dinner table, his voice casual as he asked, "Have you noticed anything strange about Aaron lately?" I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. "What do you mean?" "He's been different," Frank said, his gaze steady. "More defensive? And he spends a lot of time with you, doesn't he?" I forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "We're just getting to know each other better? Isn't that a good thing?" Frank didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. The final straw came when Jeremy confronted Aaron directly. It happened late one evening, after Frank had gone to bed. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up, when I heard raised voices coming from the backyard. "You're playing a dangerous game," Jeremy was saying. "Stay out of it," Aaron snapped. "I'm your friend, man," Jeremy shot back. "I'm trying to help you before you screw up your life. Or hers." I couldn't hear Aaron's response, but the tension in his voice sent a chill down my spine. When Aaron came inside, his expression was dark, his jaw tight. "What did he say to you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Nothing I didn't already know," he replied, his tone bitter. "Aaron, this is getting out of control," I said, stepping closer. He looked at me, his eyes filled with frustration and something deeper. Something I didn't want to name. "Then let's leave. Let's just go." His words hit me like a thunderclap, and for a moment I considered it. Leaving everything behind, starting over somewhere far away. But the weight of what that would mean pressed down on me, and I shook my head. "I can't," I whispered. Aaron's expression hardened, and he turned away. "Then we're running out of options." The storm came crashing down faster than I could prepare for it. For weeks I'd felt it brewing, the way Claire lingered when she visited, the way Jeremy's probing questions cut too close, and the way Frank's patience was slowly unraveling. Aaron and I thought we had control, that we could outmaneuver their suspicions. We were wrong. It started with Frank's sudden change in behavior. He began coming home earlier, skipping his usual rounds at the golf course or poker nights. He hovered more, asking pointed questions about how I spent my days and why Aaron hadn't pulled his weight by finding a job yet. One evening, as I cleared the dinner table, Frank leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Evelyn," he said, his voice too casual, "do you think Aaron's staying here too long?" I froze for a moment before forcing myself to keep moving. "He's figuring things out, Frank. You wanted him here, remember?" "I did, Frank replied, his gaze sharp. But I didn't expect him to get so comfortable. The words hung in the air, and my hands tightened around the edge of the plate I was holding. "What are you trying to say?" I asked, my voice steady despite the knot in my chest. Frank's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't answer. He didn't have to. A few days later, Claire arrived unannounced, as she often did. This time she had an agenda. She cornered me in the kitchen, her sharp eyes scanning my face as I wiped down the counters. "You've seemed distracted lately," she said, her tone light but probing. "Just busy," I replied, avoiding her gaze. "Busy with what?" Claire asked, her smile sharp. "Because from what I can tell, Aaron's been the one keeping you occupied." I froze, the implication in her words hitting me like a slap. "Claire, that's a ridiculous thing to say." "Is it?" she countered, stepping closer. "I'm just calling it like I see it, and I've seen the way you two look at each other. You're not as subtle as you think." The blood drained from my face, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You don't know what you're talking about." Claire's smile widened. "Maybe. Or maybe Frank needs to hear what I think." That night, I found Aaron in his room, pacing. "She knows," I said quietly, closing the door behind me. Aaron stopped, his expression darkening. "Claire? She's threatening to tell Frank," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know what to do." Aaron stepped closer, his hands resting on my shoulders. "We need to get ahead of this. Tell him ourselves." I shook my head, panic rising in my chest. "We can't. Frank will. He'll." "Evelyn," Aaron interrupted, his voice firm. "This isn't going to end on its own. We have to take control before it all blows up." But before we could decide what to do, the decision was made for us. The following evening, Frank called me into the study. Aaron wasn't home. He'd gone out to meet Jeremy, though I had my doubts about whether he'd actually show up. Frank was sitting at his desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't look up as I entered, his gaze fixed on the darkened window. "Sit down," he said, his tone flat. I hesitated before taking a seat across from him. "I've been thinking," Frank began, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "About you. About Aaron. About this house." My stomach twisted, but I said nothing. "Claire's been saying some things," Frank continued, his voice calm but deadly. "Things I didn't want to believe at first, but now I'm not so sure." "Claire's always been dramatic," I said quickly, though my voice wavered. Frank's gaze snapped to mine, his eyes hard. "Is she wrong?" My breath caught, and for a moment I couldn't speak. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low, "if there's something you need to tell me, now is the time." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the front door slammed. "Aaron." The next few moments unfolded in slow motion. Frank stood, his expression darkening as Aaron's footsteps echoed down the hallway. Aaron appeared in the doorway, stopping short when he saw us. "What's going on?" he asked, his gaze flicking between me and Frank. Frank stepped toward him, his fists clenched at his sides. "You tell me, Aaron, what's going on?" Aaron's jaw tightened and he glanced at me before turning back to Frank. "Nothing. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Frank barked, his voice echoing through the room. Aaron stood his ground, his shoulders squared. "I'm not lying." Frank turned to me, his eyes blazing. "Evelyn, is he lying?" The room fell silent, the weight of the question pressing down on me like a physical force. I felt Aaron's gaze on me, steady and unyielding, and I knew that no matter what I said, nothing would ever be the same. My voice broke and I looked away, tears streaming down my face. Frank's face twisted with rage, and he turned back to Aaron. "Get out," he said coldly. "What?" Aaron said, his voice rising. "You heard me," Frank growled. "Pack your things and get out of my house." "Frank, wait." I started, but he cut me off. "And you," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "Don't think this is over." Later that night, as I sat alone in the darkened living room, I heard the sound of Aaron's suitcase wheels on the tile floor. I stood as he approached, his face shadowed, but his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. "I'll call you," he said quietly. I nodded, unable to speak, and watched as he walked out the door. The house was unnervingly quiet after Aaron left. The air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves knew what had happened. I stayed in the living room long after he was gone, staring at the door he had walked out of, waiting for something. Frank had retreated to his study, and I could hear the faint clink of his whiskey glass against the desk. When I finally forced myself to move, I climbed the stairs to our bedroom. dreading the conversation that was waiting for me. Frank was sitting in the armchair by the window, the glass of whiskey in his hand now empty. He didn't look at me when I walked in, but I could feel the weight of his anger radiating across the room. "Frank," I started, my voice trembling. "Don't," he snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut through the air. He set the glass down with more force than necessary and finally turned to face me. "How long?" he asked, his voice low but venomous. I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "It wasn't." "How long?" he repeated, each word laced with fury. I closed my eyes, tears spilling over as I whispered, "A few months." Frank let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "A few months," he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "While I've been here in this house trusting you?" "Trusting him?" "It wasn't like that," I said quickly, though I knew how hollow the word sounded. "It wasn't planned, Frank. It just—" "Don't you dare tell me it just happened," he growled, standing abruptly. "You're my wife, Evelyn, and he's my son." "I know," I said, my voice breaking. "I know how wrong it is, but I can't undo it." Frank stared at me, his expression a mix of anger and hurt. For a moment I thought he might yell, throw something, demand more answers, but instead, he just shook his head. "I can't even look at you right now," he said quietly. He brushed past me on his way out of the room, leaving me standing there, shaking. The next morning, Frank was gone. His car wasn't in the driveway, and he hadn't left a note. I told myself he just needed space, but deep down, I knew this wasn't something that could be fixed with time. I spent the day in a haze, wandering the house aimlessly, trying to avoid the places that reminded me of Aaron. But everywhere I turned, there he was, in the kitchen, in the garden, in the library where we'd stolen so many moments. By evening, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I grabbed my phone and dialed Aaron's number, my hands trembling as I waited for him to pick up. "Evelyn," he said softly when he answered. Tears filled my eyes at the sound of his voice. "I don't know what to do," I whispered. "I'll come back," he said immediately. "No," I said quickly, shaking my head even though he couldn't see me. "You can't, not now." "Then meet me," he said. "Anywhere, just tell me where." I ended up meeting him at a small motel on the edge of town, a place far enough away that no one would recognize us. When I walked into the room, he stood and crossed to me in 2 long strides, pulling me into his arms. "I missed you," he murmured against my hair. I closed my eyes, breathing him in. "I don't know how we fix this, Aaron," I said, my voice trembling. "We'll figure it out," he said firmly. "We just need time." But time was the one thing we didn't have. The next morning I woke to find my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was a message from Frank. "Come home. We need to talk." My heart sank, and I knew what was waiting for me. When I walked into the house, Frank was sitting at the dining table, his hands clasped in front of him. He looked up when I entered, his expression cold and resolute. "I've been talking to my lawyer," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "Frank," I started, but he held up a hand to silence me. "You've made your choice, Evelyn," he said, "and now I'm making mine. I want you out of this house by the end of the week." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to stay composed. "Fine," I said quietly. "If that's what you want." Frank nodded, but there was no satisfaction in his expression. "It's what has to happen." Later, as I packed my things, I felt a strange sense of relief. The life I'd been clinging to for so long was gone. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Aaron called that evening, and when I told him what had happened, his response was immediate. "Come to me," he said. "We'll figure it out together." And for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe.